Sam Kahn, theathletic.com, with us a lot, and we appreciate it whenever he is. Sam wrote the story about the recruitment of Lake Belton five-star wide receiver Micah Hudson, and joins Craig Smoak and David Smoak on 365 Sports. Sam, yeah, this is interesting. Great article, by the way. You looked at all the angles about if he commits, what does that mean? Texas always seems to kind of wait their time, and they end up pulling some people back. I mentioned Anthony Hill. Your thoughts about what this would mean to Joey McGuire and Texas Tech if they could land Micah Hudson?
It would be huge. It would be historic for Texas Tech because in the modern era, since we started doing recruiting rankings in the early 2000s, Tech has never signed a five-star recruit. I had mentioned in my story they had tried when Cliff Kingsbury was there to get Kyler Murray, and that was not really successful for a lot of reasons, just mainly I think because the program profile wasn't there. They did end up getting a commitment from Jarrett Stidham back then, but Stidham was kind of a borderline five-star depending on what recruiting service you're using. But of course he didn't end up signing there because he flipped to Baylor at the end. But they have not been a program that attracts that level of recruit. And to me, this speaks volumes of how well that staff has done in this recruitment, because this is not a kid. Micah Hudson is not a kid that Texas Tech identified early. Like last year, they identified Calvin Simpson-Hunt from Waxahachie very early. Before he had a recruiting ranking, they already had him offered. They already had him committed. And then he rose up the ranking. Micah Hudson's a guy who's a legitimate, five-star recruit who has heard pitches from every coach out there, has been taking visits to plenty of schools, has seen a lot of what there is to see. And here we are in the middle of June, 6 months before signing day, and he's heavily, heavily considering Texas Tech, and Tech is probably the team to beat. That in and of itself, in my opinion, is a big-time accomplishment, because Texas Tech is just not a destination for them. And so I think it would have a huge impact just telling where this program is going in recruiting under Joey McGuire. And also I think it could have a residual effect on the class itself. I think when you see top 10 recruits go somewhere and go somewhere that maybe isn't traditional, it gets other recruits to kind of pay attention to what's going on over there. And so I think if Hudson does end up committing to Texas Tech, this will open some eyeballs amongst others in the 2024 and 2025 class.
Sam, I have a pretty good idea because I watched some of those guys do their thing here in Waco for a little while, and it's hard not to, root for or, be impressed by or like, a lot of those guys. Joey McGuire right at the top of the list. But what is it about Tech in particular that is a draw for Micah Hudson? Is it the personal side? Is it he loves Lubbock? Like, what do you think it is on their end, outside of just obviously they're keen evaluators and they get on guys, but as you mentioned, he's been offered by everybody. So what is it about Texas Tech that seems to stand out to Micah Hudson?
There's a few things, but I would say the number one thing has been the relationship. That is a staff that I thought, for a first-time head coach, which Joey is, I thought he did a really good job of putting together his coaching staff. And thought he really did a really good job with his personnel staff. Of course, you guys are familiar with James Blanchard, the director of player personnel, Brian Nance, the director of scouting. They were also at Baylor before. The relationships come in key here. Brian Nance, who's their scouting director, who of course was a player at Baylor and got his start in recruiting in the recruiting department at Baylor. Brian has known Micah Hudson, has been aware of him for quite some time. And built that relationship very early. They offered him. They were one of the first to offer him when Blanchard and Nance were at Baylor. They offered him way back 2 years ago when Joey was still at Baylor as well. So that relationship started back in summer of 21. So you're talking a 2-year relationship that they were in early. They were one of the very first Power 5 schools to offer him. And then when they got to Tech, he was one of the first guys they offered there. And that relationship has been really strong. And then they brought in Justin Johnson, of course. You guys know Juice. Juice has done a really good job. He's a guy who's played receiver in that offense. He played in the air raid at Houston under Cliff Kingsbury and Dana Holgerson. So he kind of played the position that Micah probably would play, if Micah ends up at Texas Tech. So I think the offense and the opportunity to go catch 70 to 100 balls in that offense, the relationship with Nance, Blanchard, McGuire, Zach Kitley has done a really good job. Juice Johnson's done a good job. I think that's been a big thing. certainly there's a family tie there. His dad, Desmond Royal, played defensive tackle at Texas Tech in the 80s. Certainly that doesn't hurt, although from what I've been told, his dad has pretty much let, Micah do his thing. It hasn't been like a big, heavy influence in terms of, hey, you got to go to Texas Tech and all that. From everything I can gather, it sounds like he's been pretty let the kid make his own decision. But certainly it doesn't hurt that you have some familiarity there, and his dad knows what it's like out there. And it just seems like he's a low-key kid. He's not a big flashy guy. He's not necessarily looking for, to be the top headline and all that stuff and make all this huge exposure. I think he's a little bit of a different guy. And I think the opportunity to go be a star somewhere where other people are not probably appeals to him a little bit.
Sam, a lot of times when a program has not landed many of them or none of them, it's not just landing that player, and a lot of times, especially a quarterback, but what does it mean when you do? Does that open up the floodgates or at least open up maybe 2 or 3 others that perhaps you probably weren't going to get because he becomes the godfather of the class?
Yeah, 100%. Because I think we've seen it lots of times over the years. When a team that does not land that type of recruit gets one, it gets other people's attention. It gets other recruits' attention that they start to wonder, what does this guy see over there that I'm not seeing? And it maybe makes you take a second look. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden a bunch of guys are going to follow you, but it certainly makes them give you a longer look. And if you give that longer look and you open the door and those coaches build some more relationships, then maybe it ends up paying off in the end. I remember I mentioned Kyler Murray at the top. I remember when Kyler came out of Allen High, guys wanted to go where he went because they knew how good of a player he was. They knew what he would be long term. And so when he ended up making his decision, that had a residual effect on that class at A&M that year because there were guys that wanted to go play with him. There are guys that have that talent or that charisma or just that mentality that other players respect it and say, you know what, if that guy had all these choices and chose to go there, maybe I should take a look and see what they've got going on.
Sam, where do you sit on who could be the kind of leaders of the new Big 12? Do you see Tech fitting that mold? I know TCU obviously a lot of success right now, or do you think it's going to be more of a wide open field, kind of like it has been where it's K-State one year, Baylor one year, Oklahoma, they had a more solid run than others, but how do you kind of see this, knowing what Tech's putting together, knowing what TCU's done and all the rest of it, what do you kind of see as the mood at the top of the conference moving forward?
It's so hard to tell because of how good and balanced the competition is in the league, but I will say this. I think the top schools, the top 2 or 3 schools in this conference are going to come from this group. K-State, Oklahoma State, TCU, Baylor, and Tech. K-State obviously just won the conference, and I think you have to like the direction they're moving under Chris Kleiman, and they've won at least 8 games each 3 of the last 4 years. And obviously they've won 3 Big 12 titles in their history. So there's some history there. Oklahoma State has a stability factor with Gundy, longest tenured head coach in the league. They played for the title 2 years ago, were 1 play away from winning it. They've won double-digit games 7 times since 2010. But they've only won double-digit games once in the last 5 years, and I think this is a big year for them. So how they do this year, I think, is going to be very telling for Oklahoma State. TCU made the playoff, and that's something that no school outside of Oklahoma has done in the Big 12. And that says a lot, but I do think it's hard to repeat that success. But when you look at all the ingredients, TCU's got them. The money, donors, good recruiting footprint, good location. They use the transfer portal well. I think they've got a good staff. Baylor, I think, has to be in that conversation. They've won 3 Big 12 titles in the last decade. They're well-resourced. They're building facilities. I also do think, though, that this is a big year for them to see how they go after they had a really great year 2 years ago winning the conference. Had a down year last year. I want to see how do they respond and what is the true identity of a Baylor football team under Dave Aranda. I think this year kind of tells us that case, but when you look at the last decade, there's no reason Baylor shouldn't be in that conversation. And then when we talk about Texas Tech, they haven't really won at that level. They haven't won more than 8 games in the last 13 years. But when you look at the trajectory, you look at the way they're recruiting, you look at the investment they put in NIL, they're putting huge investment in facilities. I do think they're on that trajectory to get into that conversation. So of the teams that are going to be there, those are the 5 that I would choose from. And right now, if I'm picking one right now, I think I'm a little bit keen on K-State and Oklahoma State just because I like the 2 coaches there and the direction that the K-State's going, and I like the stability that Gundy's provided Oklahoma State at this time.
It seems like, and I don't know, just thinking about it, but since Matt Rule's first year, 1-11, we know it was a disaster, and they were just trying to survive, overcoming everything that occurred at Baylor. And the next year, they were pretty good. I think that was okay. The next year, no way anyone expected them to play for the Big 12 title. They did. And then he leaves, and Baylor drops back to 2-7. COVID had a lot to do with it, and a coaching change. No one expected 12-2. Last year, they went backwards. Does that mean that they're primed to surprise a few people? And how important is it for Aranda to put together a second winning season or better after right now just 1 of 3?
Yeah, no, I think it's huge because if you don't have a good season this year and you're back to the 6-6 type year, I think you start to have people ask the question, well, did you win the Big 12 title because you had a lot of the talent that was on the roster already that was recruited by your predecessor? And I think it's a legitimate question. This is starting to look more like Dave Aranda's team now in terms of, and they've turned members of the staff over a few times. They've done some more work in the transfer portal a lot more aggressively this year than they have in the past. And I know that was an adjustment for Dave. And one thing I'll give Dave credit for is Dave really is willing to make changes when he realizes that something he did didn't work. And he's usually the first one to say, hey, I made this decision. It didn't work out. Let's fix it. And I like that about him. But I do think, yes, do they have potential to take a step up this year? 100%. Because when we look at, let's not forget, they were going into the second week in November last year, 6-3, and had a chance to go. If they would have won out, they would have been able to go to the Big 12 title. So they were in that conversation in November, and then of course we all know what happened. They lost 3 games in a row, but they had TCU on the ropes. I mean, they took a fire drill field goal to beat them. You know, they lost a close game at BYU that the offense was just a little bit disjointed, and it was a tough environment, and obviously it didn't go their way. There were some opportunities there that they had last year that they could have easily ended up 8 wins or 9 wins possibly if some things bounced a different direction. But so I don't think it's a bad team. I don't think it was a bad team. I think it was just some things just didn't go their way, and maybe they're just still searching for their identity a little bit. But I do think they are going to be better this year. Now, are they 8-4 better, or are they 10-2 contending for the conference title better? That I don't know, and that's what's going to be fascinating to see. How
about a more not an angry Dave Aranda, but one who's not going to put up with the we saw A.J. McCarty recently, who's probably, I don't know where he ends up at Tech or whoever, but there are thoughts that perhaps that was Dave maybe putting his foot down on just nothing bad, but just enough, And your thoughts about a tougher, not angrier, but more demanding Dave Aranda?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it harkens back to that quote that he gave in spring football about finding that balance of giving guys opportunities and giving guys second chances and third chances, but eventually getting run over. And it's hard because you want to instill discipline in your program, but you also want players to feel like they can come to you and that you care about them and that it's not just a transactional nature in the relationship. And I think Dave is more aware of that, and he has more human being to him than most college coaches that I've come across, and I appreciate that. But it is a challenge, and so there's a fine line of him being tougher and making those decisions, which I think are critical. You have to win at a high level. I can promise you, Kirby Smart and Nick Saban are certainly not having problems making those decisions. But you also have to be yourself, because if you are not yourself and you start trying to be somebody else, the players are going to see right through that. They're not dumb. They know who you are. They know who you've been. And so it's a really fine line to walk, to get tougher and hold people accountable while at the same time still being who you are. And that's where I think Dave Aranda is going to have to master that. And it's an evolution. It's an ongoing evolution for him. But like I said, I appreciate his candor, his introspection, because I know a lot of guys in that position who will just keep doing the same thing and hope for different results because that's the way they've always done it. And Dave has shown a willingness to change and adjust as time goes on to try to make his team better.
Sam, great article on the Micah Hudson sweepstakes and how it affects Texas Tech, or could, and also Texas among others. Thanks for your time as always. We appreciate it whenever you're available.
No problem. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Sam Kahn, theathletic.com, with us on the story